J.League Perfect Striker 3 is a soccer game that was released by Konami for the PlayStation 2 in Japan in 2001. And for many that may not know, this essentially is primarily a version of the International Superstar Soccer game that had also been released prior on the PlayStation in other regions earlier in 2000, as it essentially played the same. It had the same type of visuals, graphics, play style, but it would add in a few more additional features that focused around club specific teams that were part of the Japanese Football League at the time. And you also had the various attributes that would have been commonly known with the ISS Pro games at the time, where you could change the various stats of the players, and you could change even the form of whether they were on form or whether they weren't on form, good or bad. And you could also change various other statistics and aspects and change the different types of formations and tactics that had become prevalent in the ISS Pro series of the bygone era. And it utilises the same game engine pretty much as the ISS Pro game, and it plays identical to it, just focusing more so on the club teams from the Japanese league, but essentially it's the same game overall. And the thing is, you'll find that a lot once you start diving into looking at other soccer games on the PS2 specifically, more so than the PS1, even though the PS1 did have similar ideas in terms of games, especially from different regions, where you would have the same game that would either be rebranded or would be reskinned but given a different aesthetic. But on the PS2 it was definitely a lot more noticeable. On the PS1 was definitely a lot more individual type games that were totally different from their mainstream counterparts, whereas the PS2, while it did have a crazy number of soccer games, the majority of them were always from the same developers, and a lot of them were just rehashes of games that had been out previously. They just added in a few different features here and there, maybe like in this case they changed the teams around, but essentially it was the same game overall. It played the exact same, had the same look and feel, the same type of graphics, the same control systems, visual aesthetics. The only main differences again would be some of the visual references in terms of the players, like they would have different facial expressions again with the club teams, but it also have different dynamics in terms of the commentary, as again it would be Japanese commentators rather than English commentators. But the game for the most part plays identical. Now the button combinations is also dependent on the regions that you're playing, and sometimes can be somewhat different, and although it can be difficult to understand the language, and that can always be a barrier to entry for a lot of these games, but when you play around it a little bit, eventually you'll be able to find a system that works well for you. And especially if you have played any of the ISS Pro games in other regions, it won't take you long to be able to pick up the whole idea behind playing the game and what it's going to do, because if you've played one, you've pretty much played them all in most regards, because they do play very, very similarly. And this game is no different to that, as it does focus a lot more on, like the previous ISS game as I mentioned, on arcade style gameplay more so than simulation focused gameplay. The later entries in the series, like with ISS 2 and ISS 3, would move away more so from the arcade idea and focus more on simulation, that would later become the Pro Evo series. But in Japan still kind of stayed with their own thing, where they had their own Japanese league type soccer games, where they just really used many elements from the ISS Pro games just to kind of create their own versions, our own league kind of add-ons, if you will, because if it was to be added in today's market, these would be classed as add-ons and not individual games as such. But that's just the way games would have been developed back then. So if you've played the original ISS on the PS2, this here game will play the exact same, maybe bar a few of the control buttons, but again you'll figure it out as you play. But it is the same game overall. It's still fun to play. It does take a little bit of getting used to if you're a beginner, if you're not used to these type of games, but once you do, it's very simple in its nature and what it represents and what it's really trying to do, and it won't take you long to figure things out and to know exactly who your favourite team is going to be in all regards. But it is what it is. It's an early idea of a game that just kind of just had different iterations of it over time, but it's still a fun game regardless of whatever version you do play. It's a fun game in general just to get involved with. It's fun to play with your mates, and if you genuinely want more of an arcade focused experience with your football games, this one here won't go far wrong. And I would love to know your thoughts on J.League Perfect Striker 3, or even the likes of International Superstar Soccer on the PS2, because essentially they're the same game anyway. So I'd love to know your thoughts on this, and even with other types of Konami style football games that would also have been released in Japan, and did you get to play any of these other types of iterations of these soccer games? I'd love to hear whatever stories you do have of those games, so be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you have enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be updated of future videos. And in the meantime, if you would like to see more content around similar type of soccer games also released on the PS2 from various regions. Then make sure to check out the playlist here on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, I will see you in the next one.